Do you wake from a night of sleeping with a pool of saliva around your pillow? Or do you have a tendency to wake up in the middle of the night needing to drink water because your mouth is dry? If so, you just might be a mouth breather. So how does mouth breathing, core pressure, and pelvic health all relate? Tune in to find out. Welcome to another episode of From Tongue to Tailbone. I really wanted to address this topic because I see this so much in many of my pelvic patients with some type of pelvic dysfunction, such as urinary incontinence. So if you didn't catch my previous episode on the hidden link between the tongue, posture, and pelvic floor, please make sure that you watch that. But let's get into mouth breathing a bit more, okay? So generally, when the tongue has poor tone, then that's why we see it resting along the floor of the mouth instead of it suctioned up along the roof of the mouth, then we can actually see mouth breathing occur. So this can happen for several reasons. So there could be a tongue or a lip tie that's affecting the position of the tongue. The shape or size of the tongue can also be too big, and so it would be too big to fit inside the mouth, and this could also be due to crowding of the teeth. It could be a small upper palate along the maxilla, and that can also create some mouth breathing as well, or the tongue to be down. There could be an issue where the tongue is thrusting forward, and a lot of this could be due to the position of the head and the neck, thrusting the tongue to thrust forward and push against our teeth, causing malocclusion or also a bad bite, what's also known as a bad bite with our teeth. It could also just be that we have a really bad habit where we've adopted over a really long period of time that now it's really hard to break out of, ensuring that we're not mouth breathing. So when mouth breathing occurs and the tongue is resting on the floor of the mouth, there's less optimal breathing opportunities. Luckily, our body is very smart and will ensure that we stay alive by breathing as much as we can, but we're limiting certain things in our body when we are mouth breathing and not nostril breathing. So we end up breathing at a much faster rate, or we overbreathe. Much of it can be due to stress, a tendency towards being more sedentary, or thinking we are doing a really good job of taking in by really big breaths, where naturality, we're actually taking in smaller amounts of air when we breathe in deeply. Ideally, we want long, slow, not short and fast breaths. So the short and fast or shallow breathing that occurs can then have an impact on the overall movement of our respiratory diaphragm. So if we are unable to maintain an optimal amount of pressure in our abdominal area, that can cause an increased amount of pressure down into our pelvic cavity. And this less than ideal pressure system can then be a cause for pelvic floor dysfunction, either creating tension because we don't like the feeling of that excess pressure or heaviness that's present in our pelvic floor, and it can cause us to tighten even more, leading to pelvic pain or other symptoms, or that excess pressure can actually make it easier for one to leak urine when they're coughing or sneezing, and thus we end up having stress urinary incontinence. So let's use a balloon to see how this less than ideal pressure system can impact the pelvic floor when we're mouth. So I have this balloon that is blown up, and we're going to use this as a model of what occurs in our abdominal cavity. So on the top is going to be the respiratory diaphragm, and then on the bottom is going to be our pelvic diaphragm. So what happens is ideally is that when we take an inhalation, the respiratory diaphragm is actually going to depress down, and so it's a contraction, depresses down, and so we see in the middle of the balloon how that creates a little bit of the distension or a widening, bigness of the belly, and then also there's going to be a dropping down into the pelvic diaphragm. And so then vice versa, or the reverse of that would happen when we exhale. So when we exhale, the breath is moving out either through our nose or through our mouth, and that pelvic diaphragm is drawing back up. And if I let this hand go of that pressure, then the respiratory diaphragm is drawing back up. So there's this constant movement that's happening. But what occurs with mouth breathing is that this respiratory diaphragm ends up kind of getting a little bit stuck. And so when we shallow breathe, or when we take, when we're over breathing and we're taking really short and fast breaths, it doesn't really allow for this nice dynamic movement that's occurring between these two diaphragms. And so with the shallow breathing or mouth breathing, then what occurs is that this diaphragm just kind of stays shallow. So we don't get a lot of movement that's happening here at the top. And then if I take I'm gonna hold on here to the top, and then what occurs is that if I were to take my hand, this is gonna be, again, the core or the abdomen, And so if this is staying shallow while I'm mouth breathing, and then there's no big amount of pressure that's happening here through the space, and we end up over breathing, especially as we're exhaling to be able to try to get that air out, we actually create a little bit more squeezing. And if you can see that as I squeeze here through the center, then there's going to be more pressure has to go somewhere. So if it's not going up because it's kind of like staying stuck, and then if you can see the bottom of that balloon and how there's going to be more pressure downward, because then I'm utilizing these muscles, especially as I'm doing that inhalation, I'm increasing that amount of pressure to be able to put more downward pressure down into my pelvic bowl. And so ideally, again, what we want is going to be more nostril breathing, so that way we're able to take long, slow breaths. We're actually able to utilize this movement of our diaphragm rather than shallow breathing, where the respiratory diaphragm is staying stiff. And then as we inhale, this doesn't create a lot of movement. We end up creating even more pressure. And because we create more pressure, then that pelvic diaphragm has to go down, or there's more excessive pressure or heaviness, because that's where the vulnerability potentially could be. And then we have more leakage present. So how do we want to be breathing? So mouth closed, tongue up, and breathing in and out through nose is going to be ideal. When we exhale, it should be a long and slow exhalation. We want to try for about like 4 to 6 seconds. So you can give this a try, and if you find that it's challenging, that's okay. Your body is just having to get used to this new sensation and movement, so it's going to be normal for you to want to give it some time until it becomes your new habit. So thank you so much for sticking around and listening. And if you found this information helpful, consider subscribing for weekly tips on connecting pelvic health with myo and oral function. You can leave a comment below, and I'd love to hear from you and have you share a little bit about if you've had a similar experience with mouth breathing. See you next time.